Close your eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to remember. There was a time, perhaps you can still feel its ghost, when you lived inside a story you didn't know you were telling, when the world made sense because you hadn't yet questioned the sense maker, when sleep came easy because you hadn't discovered the watcher who never sleeps. Then something changed. Perhaps it was gradual, a slow erosion, like water wearing stone. Or perhaps it arrived all at once, a single moment when the carefully constructed architecture of your reality revealed its scaffolding, and you saw with terrible clarity that everything you thought was solid was actually held together by nothing more than agreement, consensus, a shared hallucination we call civilization, and in that moment you felt it, the vertigo of awakening. The Sufis have a saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. But they don't tell you about the space between, the excruciating gap where you've lost the comfort of ignorance but haven't yet found the peace of wisdom. That liminal territory where awareness feels less like a gift and more like a curse, where seeing clearly doesn't illuminate the path, it reveals the abyss. This is not a comfortable conversation. We are not here for easy answers or spiritual platitudes. We are here to explore one of the most terrifying and transformative experiences of human consciousness. The moment when awareness itself becomes unbearable, when the very act of seeing deeply makes you feel like you're losing your mind. Welcome to the territory where awakening feels like madness. Tonight, we descend together into this paradox. We will trace its origins through the hidden corridors of psychology and philosophy. We will meet those who have walked this path before, some who returned transformed, others who never returned at all. We will explore the neuroscience of consciousness turning upon itself, and we will ask the questions that have haunted mystics, madmen, and philosophers for millennia. What happens when you become too aware? When is seeing too much the same as seeing nothing at all? And how do we distinguish between the madness of breakdown and the madness of breakthrough? The ancient Greeks had a word, metanoia. It means a transformative change of heart, a fundamental shift in perception. But its literal translation is even more revealing, beyond the mind. To go beyond the mind, you must first watch it destroy itself. You must witness the death of the one who thinks they are watching. This is season 2 of our journey, the awakening. But not the awakening of greeting card spirituality, where everything becomes light and love and cosmic unity. No, this is the awakening that feels like falling, the one that strips you bare, the one that makes you question whether consciousness is a gift from the gods or a cosmic mistake. A glitch in the evolutionary algorithm that gave us just enough awareness to see our own absurdity, but not enough to transcend it. Are you ready? Because once we begin this journey, there is no unseeing what we discover. The door, once opened, cannot be closed. The veil, once lifted, cannot be lowered. And the self, once examined, can never again pretend to be the solid, singular thing it once believed itself to be. Let me tell you a story. It's a true story, though truth becomes a slippery concept in this territory. In 1961, a researcher named Sidney Cohen conducted a study on LSD before it became the psychedelic fuel of counterculture rebellion, when it was still a legitimate tool of psychiatric exploration. One of his subjects, a successful architect in his 40s, took a moderate dose and spent the next 8 hours experiencing what he later described as the complete dissolution of everything I thought I was. But here's what's fascinating. He didn't describe it as a mystical experience. He described it as terror, pure, existential terror. He said it felt like watching himself from outside, seeing all his thoughts and motivations as mechanical processes, observing his entire personality as a construct, arbitrary, fragile, and ultimately meaningless. For weeks after, he couldn't work. Couldn't sleep. He told Cohen, "I've been cursed with seeing. I can't unsee it now. Every morning I wake up and have to convince myself that there's a reason to be the person I was yesterday." Eventually he recovered, learned to integrate the experience, but something had permanently shifted. He described it as living in two worlds simultaneously, the world of normal human activity and the world of witnessing that activity from somewhere else. He never fully shook the feeling, he said, that he was playing pretend at being himself. This is the paradox we're exploring. This man had an insight into the nature of consciousness and selfhood that philosophers and meditators spend lifetimes trying to achieve. He saw through the illusion of the separate self. He glimpsed the constructed nature of identity. By all accounts, he touched enlightenment. So why did it feel like madness? The answer to that question will take us on a journey through the deepest mysteries of the human psyche. We will explore the razor's edge between transcendence and psychosis. We will examine what happens when the ego, that necessary fiction that holds our world together, begins to dissolve. We will look at the neuroscience of self-awareness, turning cancerous, consuming itself. And we will discover that madness and awakening may not be opposites at all, but two faces of the same transformation. The philosopher Nietzsche wrote, "And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." But what he didn't say, what perhaps he couldn't say until it happened to him, is what occurs when you realize that you are both the gazer and the abyss. That there is no one looking into the darkness, because the darkness is the looking itself. This is where awareness feels like madness. We live in an age obsessed with consciousness. Silicon Valley billionaires fund neuroscience labs searching for the neural correlates of awareness. Psychedelics are experiencing a renaissance in therapeutic settings. Meditation apps promise enlightenment in 10 minutes a day. We are told that expanding consciousness is the next frontier of human evolution, that we must become more aware, more present, more awake. But no one warns you about the cost. No one tells you that awareness, when it reaches a certain intensity, can feel like being flayed alive, that every new layer of seeing strips away another layer of protection, that consciousness, when it turns fully upon itself, creates a paradox that can shatter the mind. Because here's the secret they don't tell you in the mindfulness apps. The self that wants to become more aware is the same self that will be destroyed by that awareness. The ego that seeks enlightenment is the ego that must die for enlightenment to occur. And that death, that necessary death, feels exactly like madness. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a stage called bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. It's described as a place of terrifying visions, where the deceased encounters wrathful deities and peaceful deities, all projections of their own mind. The text offers guidance. Recognize these visions as illusions. See them for what they are, products of consciousness itself, and you will be liberated. But what if we don't need to die to enter the bardo? What if awareness itself, when it reaches a certain depth, creates the same experience? What if psychological death, ego death, is the bardo of the living? Over the next 2 hours, we will explore this territory together. Not as distant observers, but as participants, because if you're listening to these words, chances are you've already felt the tremors. Maybe you've had moments when reality seemed too thin, too arbitrary, when you caught yourself performing your life rather than living it, when you realized that the voice in your head, the one you think of as you, is just another object that you're aware of, which means the real you must be something else entirely. Something that can't be named or grasped or understood, and in that realization, the ground falls away. This is the crisis of consciousness, the awakening that feels like breaking, and it's happening not just to individuals, but to our entire species. We are living through a collective dark night of the soul, where the old stories no longer hold, but the new ones haven't yet emerged, where technology has amplified our awareness without expanding our wisdom, where we can see everything, every injustice, every catastrophe, every horror, but feel powerless to change anything. Is it any wonder that anxiety and depression have become the defining mental health conditions of our age? That so many people report feeling disconnected, disoriented, derealized? We are a species becoming too aware for our own comfort. We have eaten from the tree of knowledge, and now we cannot return to Eden's innocent sleep. But here's the question that will guide our journey. What if this madness is the path? What if the feeling of losing your mind is actually the first sign that you're finding something deeper? What if the terror of awareness is the birthplace of transformation? The mystics say, die before you die. The psychologists say, integrate the shadow. The philosophers say, know thyself. But they're all pointing to the same terrible truth. True awakening requires a kind of death, not physical death, but the death of the psychological self, the death of the character in the story, the death of the one who thinks they're in control. And death, even psychological death, feels like madness. So let us begin this descent. Let us trace the origins of this crisis back through history, back through the evolution of consciousness itself. Let us meet the scientists and mystics who have mapped this territory. Let us explore the conflict, the terrifying moment when awareness turns against itself. And let us discover, if we can, whether there is wisdom on the other side of this madness. Because this is not just a personal crisis. This is the crisis of our species. And how we navigate it, how we integrate this awareness without being destroyed by it, may determine whether consciousness itself survives in this corner of the universe. The journey begins now. Are you still with me? Good. Because we're about to discover that everything you think you know about consciousness, sanity, and self is about to be called into question. And once that questioning begins, there is no going back to the comfortable illusions of sleep. Welcome to the awakening that feels like madness. Let us begin. The first break, when consciousness turned inward. Picture the Earth 4 billion years ago, a molten sphere, pregnant with possibility. No consciousness yet, no awareness. Just chemical reactions cascading through time, following the blind logic of physics and chance. Then, gradually, over eons that make human history look like a single breath, something extraordinary emerged. Single cells became multicellular organisms. Organisms developed nervous systems. Nervous systems complexified into brains, and brains, somewhere along the way, developed a strange capacity. They could model the world inside themselves. A fish doesn't need to be aware that it's aware to swim. A bird doesn't need consciousness to fly. But somewhere in our evolutionary past, a threshold was crossed. The brain became complex enough to not just respond to the world, but to create an internal representation of itself responding to the world. Consciousness achieved self-reference. The mirror turned toward itself, and in that moment, something broke. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger calls it the phenomenal self-model, the brain's representation of itself as a unified, persisting entity. But here's the trick. This model, this sense of being a self, is so convincing that we forget it's a model. We mistake the map for the territory. We believe we are the self, rather than recognizing that the self is something the brain is doing. This is the original madness, the first delusion. And it's so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of our experience, that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. The ancient Vedic sages of India discovered this thousands of years ago. In the Upanishads, they wrote about Maya, the veil of illusion that makes the one appear as many, that makes the eternal appear as temporary, that makes pure consciousness appear as separate selves. They understood, without neuroscience or brain scans, that the individual self is a fiction, a useful fiction, perhaps necessary for survival, but a fiction nonetheless. But here's where it gets interesting. They also warned about the dangers of this knowledge. There's a story in the Chandogya Upanishad about a student named Svetaketu who returns from his teacher having learned that Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that. He has learned that his individual self is not separate from the universal consciousness, that the distinction between subject and object is illusory. He's ecstatic with this knowledge. He has, as we might say today, awakened. But the text doesn't end there. It describes how Svetaketu has to spend years integrating this knowledge, learning how to live in the world after seeing through its fundamental illusion. Because knowing you're not a separate self is one thing. Living in a world that operates entirely on the assumption that you are, that's something else entirely. This is the first hint of our central paradox. Awakening to the illusory nature of the self doesn't free you from having to be a self. You still need to get up in the morning, make decisions, relate to other apparent selves. You still need to function in a consensus reality built entirely on the fiction you've just seen through, and that tension between knowing the truth and living the lie can feel like madness. The Western discovery, Descartes, and the burden of self-awareness. Let's jump forward to 17th century France. René Descartes, sitting by his fireplace, decides to doubt everything. He will strip away all assumptions, all received wisdom, until he finds something he cannot doubt, something absolutely certain. He doubts his senses. They can deceive. He doubts the external world. It might be a dream. He doubts mathematics. Perhaps a demon is manipulating his thoughts. But then he arrives at his famous conclusion. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. In that moment, Descartes believed he had found bedrock, the one thing that cannot be doubted, the existence of the thinking self. But what he actually did was inaugurate Western philosophy's obsession with consciousness, and with it, a new form of existential anxiety. Because once you make the thinking self the foundation of reality, you create a problem. If I am essentially my thoughts, then what am I when I'm not thinking? If consciousness is what I am, then what is the I that is conscious? Descartes had split the world in two, mind and matter, subject and object, the observer and the observed, and that split has haunted Western culture ever since. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, 300 years later, would describe this split as the gaze, the moment when you realize that you are both the one looking and the one being looked at, the moment when consciousness becomes self-conscious, when awareness folds back on itself. And in that folding, Sartre said, we experience nausea, a profound disgust at the arbitrariness of existence, at the vertigo of freedom, at the responsibility of having to create meaning in a universe that offers none. Sartre's nausea is our madness, the existential anxiety of being aware that you're aware, of being responsible for your own consciousness, of having no fixed essence to fall back on. You are, Sartre said, condemned to be free, condemned to constantly create yourself through your choices, never able to rest in a stable identity. Is it any wonder that existentialism emerged in the wake of World War I, when the old certainties had been shattered, when the grand narratives of progress and divine order had been revealed as hollow? The same awareness that promised liberation, the awareness that we are free, that we create our own meaning, also revealed a terrifying abyss. If there is no inherent meaning, if we are truly free, then every choice matters infinitely, and not at all simultaneously. This is the Western discovery of the same truth the East had known for millennia. Self-awareness, when pushed to its logical conclusion, reveals a void. Not a comforting void, not a mystical emptiness, but a vertiginous absence where you expected to find yourself. Jung's shadow, the darkness within awareness. But the real exploration of awareness as potential madness came from a different source, depth psychology. And no one mapped this territory more thoroughly than Carl Gustav Jung. Jung began his career as Freud's protégé, but he broke away to develop his own understanding of the psyche. And central to Jung's vision was a terrifying idea, the shadow. The shadow, Jung said, is everything we don't want to see about ourselves. It's not just our repressed memories or forbidden desires. It's the vast unconscious machinery that operates beneath awareness. It's the instincts we deny, the capacities for cruelty and destruction that we project onto others, the primitive forces that civilization barely contains. And here's Jung's crucial insight. Becoming aware of the shadow doesn't make it go away. In fact, confronting the shadow can be psychologically catastrophic. Jung warned that looking too deeply into the unconscious without proper preparation was like opening a dam. You could be overwhelmed by forces you couldn't control. He wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." But he also knew the inverse was true. When you make an inner situation conscious, when you truly see the shadow, it can feel like fate collapsing inward, like the external world losing its solidity because you've realized it's all a projection. Jung had his own experience of this in 1913, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. For several years, he experienced visions, heard voices, felt himself fragmenting into multiple personalities. He later realized this wasn't madness, or rather, it was madness in service of a deeper integration. He was experiencing what he would later call the process of individuation, the terrifying, necessary journey of integrating the unconscious with the conscious, the shadow with the light. But during the process, Jung couldn't be sure he wasn't simply going insane. He kept a journal, later published as The Red Book, filled with encounters with inner figures, archetypal beings that spoke to him, showed him visions, pulled him into landscapes of the psyche that felt more real than ordinary reality. He functioned outwardly, maintained his practice, his family life, but inwardly he was navigating a breakdown that felt like a breakthrough, or a breakthrough that felt like a breakdown. The line between the two, he discovered, was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The schizophrenia question. When awareness fractures. This brings us to one of the most troubling questions in the study of consciousness. What is the relationship between mystical awakening and mental illness? Between the shaman's vision and the schizophrenic's hallucination? In the 1960s, psychiatrist R.D. Laing proposed a radical idea. What if schizophrenia wasn't a disease to be cured, but a natural healing process? What if the voices, the delusions, the apparent madness were attempts by the psyche to break through societal conditioning and reach a more authentic mode of being? Laing suggested that schizophrenics were, in a sense, more awake than normal people. They had broken through the consensus reality that the rest of us accept unquestioningly. The problem wasn't that they were sick, it was that society couldn't accommodate their expanded awareness. This view was popular in countercultural circles, but was largely rejected by mainstream psychiatry. And for good reason, schizophrenia causes real suffering. The voices are often tormenting, the delusions are frequently paranoid, the inability to function, to maintain relationships, to care for oneself, these aren't signs of spiritual awakening, they're signs of a brain in crisis. And yet, Laing's question lingers. Because there are cases, documented, studied, researched, where the line blurs, where mystical experiences and psychotic breaks share remarkably similar features. Both involve dissolution of ego boundaries, a sense that the ordinary self is false, vivid visions or auditory experiences, feelings of cosmic significance, inability to function in normal social roles, a conviction that one has accessed a deeper truth. The difference, some researchers suggest, isn't in the experience itself, but in integration. Can you return from the dissolution? Can you maintain functioning in ordinary reality while holding the expanded awareness? Can you, as the Zen saying goes, carry water and chop wood after enlightenment? The mystic returns. The schizophrenic doesn't. But what about those in between? Those who've touched something real, something transformative, but haven't fully integrated it. Those who feel they're going mad because they're caught between two worlds, the world of ordinary consciousness and the world beyond the veil. This is where awareness feels like madness. In the liminal space, in the bardo, in the gap between ego death and rebirth. The neuroscience of self-dissolution. Modern neuroscience has begun to map this territory with remarkable precision, and what they're finding supports what mystics and madmen have always known. The self is not a thing, it's a process, a dance of neural networks that creates the illusion of unity. The default mode network, a constellation of brain regions active when we're not focused on the external world, appears to be responsible for self-referential thought. When you daydream, plan the future, remember the past, or think about yourself, the default mode network lights up. It's the neural correlate of the ego, the self-structure. And here's what's fascinating. In deep meditation, in mystical experiences, and in psychedelic states, the default mode network quiets down, sometimes dramatically. Brain scans of experienced meditators show reduced activity in the regions associated with self-reference. People taking psilocybin or LSD show even more dramatic decreases, and they report, consistently, a sense of ego dissolution. The boundaries between self and world become porous. The narrative of I becomes optional. There's awareness, but no one doing the awareness. Consciousness without a subject. This is what the Buddhists call anatta, no self. And neuroscience confirms the feeling of being a unified, continuous self is constructed by the brain. Turn down the activity in certain regions, and that feeling dissolves. But here's the critical point. For most of human history, the default mode network runs continuously. The ego is always online. The sense of being a separate self is so constant, so automatic, that we never question it. It is reality. So what happens when it suddenly goes offline? When the sense of self dissolves, not gradually through years of meditation practice, but suddenly, catastrophically, without preparation? It feels like dying. It feels like madness. Because the brain, hardwired by evolution to maintain the self-structure, interprets ego dissolution as a threat. Red alerts fire across neural networks. Panic systems activate. The organism believes it's in mortal danger. Because in a very real sense it is. The self is dying. Not the body, not consciousness itself, but the construct we call I is dissolving. And from the perspective of that I, this is indistinguishable from annihilation. This is why forced awakenings can be traumatic, why some people emerge from intense psychedelic experiences not enlightened but psychologically damaged, why meditation retreats sometimes trigger psychotic breaks. The ego cannot be forced to die. It can only be coaxed gradually, with care and integration, toward voluntary dissolution. And even then, even with preparation, with guidance, with intention, the moment of letting go feels like madness. The evolutionary paradox. So we arrive at a profound question. Why did consciousness evolve the capacity to witness its own dissolution? Why would evolution create a system capable of seeing through itself? One theory, consciousness reached a tipping point. It became complex enough to be useful for survival, allowing planning, abstract thought, social cognition, but in becoming that complex, it inevitably became self-aware, and self-awareness, by its nature, contains the seeds of its own transcendence. It's like a computer program sophisticated enough to examine its own code. Once you can do that, you can see that the code is arbitrary, that it could be written differently, that you, the program, are not a fixed entity, but a set of instructions that could be modified. This realization is either liberating or terrifying, depending on your perspective. The philosopher Daniel Dennett argues that consciousness is an illusion, not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but in the sense that it creates an illusion, the illusion of a central controller, a unified self making decisions. In reality, Dennett says, there's just a pandemonium of competing processes, and consciousness is the story the brain tells about itself after the fact. But if that's true, if the self is an illusion, then becoming aware of the illusion doesn't dispel it. You can know intellectually that the self is constructed, but you still feel like a self. You still experience continuity, agency, identity. The illusion persists even after it's been revealed as illusion. And living with that knowledge, knowing you're a fiction that can't stop fictionalizing itself, that's its own kind of madness. This is the evolutionary paradox. Consciousness became aware enough to see that awareness itself is constructed. We are the universe looking at itself, but in looking, we create a false boundary between the looker and the looked at. We are the problem we're trying to solve, the disease trying to cure itself, the dream attempting to wake from itself while remaining asleep. No wonder it feels like madness. The warning from history. Before we descend deeper into this crisis, let us heed the warnings of history, because humanity has been here before, and not everyone who ventured into these depths returned. Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God was dead and that we must become our own creators of value. He advocated for the Übermensch, the overman who could live without the old certainties, who could create meaning in a meaningless universe. But Nietzsche himself collapsed into madness in Turin, embracing a horse in the street, weeping. He spent the last decade of his life in psychiatric care, his brilliant mind fragmented. Was his madness caused by syphilis, as biographers claim? Or was it the logical conclusion of staring too long into the abyss of meaning's absence? Virginia Woolf wrote with devastating clarity about the nature of consciousness, capturing the stream of thought in ways that had never been done before. She saw deeply into the constructed nature of self and reality, and she walked into the river Ouse with stones in her pockets, unable to bear the weight of that seeing. John Nash, the mathematician, made breakthrough discoveries in game theory that revolutionized economics, but he also descended into paranoid schizophrenia, seeing patterns that weren't there, convinced that he was receiving coded messages from extraterrestrial beings. His mind, so adept at finding order in chaos, began finding order where none existed. These are not failures, they are warnings. The territory we're exploring is dangerous. The mind, when it turns upon itself with sufficient intensity, can break in ways that cannot be repaired. Awareness, pushed too far too fast, can shatter the very structure needed to contain it. And yet we must explore it. Because the alternative, remaining in comfortable unconsciousness, is no longer viable. We are a species in crisis. Our old stories have died, our certainties have dissolved. We are, collectively, experiencing the dark night that these individuals experienced privately. So we proceed, carefully, with reverence for those who were lost in this territory, and with hope that we can learn from their journeys. The origins are clear now. Consciousness evolved to a point where it could witness itself. And in that witnessing, a crack appeared, a fissure, a gap between the observer and the observed that, when examined closely enough, reveals that there is no one on either side. Just awareness, aware of itself, creating the illusion of separation. And when that illusion cracks, when the gap reveals itself as the only reality, when you realize that you are not in consciousness, but consciousness is what you are, that's when awareness feels like madness. But we're only beginning this descent. The real crisis lies ahead. The trigger, when something breaks. It rarely announces itself. There's no trumpet call that heralds the beginning of psychological unraveling. For most people, it starts small. A moment of derealization in the grocery store. Suddenly everything feels fake, staged. An evening where you catch yourself speaking and wonder who's choosing the words. A morning when you can't remember why you get out of bed, not because you're depressed, but because the entire premise of being a person seems suddenly, inexplicably arbitrary. Let me tell you about Maya. Maya was a 32-year-old corporate lawyer, successful by every external measure. She woke up one Tuesday. She remembers it was Tuesday because she had a major client presentation, and while brushing her teeth, she had a thought that wouldn't leave. Why am I pretending this matters? Not the presentation specifically, everything. The whole performance of being Maya. She looked at herself in the mirror and for the first time really saw what she was looking at. A stranger. A collection of habits and reactions and learned behaviors that had somehow convinced itself it was a unified person with goals and desires and meaning. She went to work. Did the presentation. It went well. On autopilot, her training carried her through. But inside, something had broken. She described it later as watching myself from far away, seeing all my gestures and words as mechanical, as programmed responses to stimuli. She wasn't having a panic attack. She wasn't feeling sad or anxious. She was feeling aware, too aware. Within 2 weeks, she couldn't maintain the performance. She took medical leave, saw therapists who diagnosed anxiety, depression, depersonalization disorder. The medications didn't help because she wasn't sick in the way they understood sickness. She had glimpsed something, the constructed nature of selfhood, and that glimpse had undermined the entire structure she'd built her life upon. This is how it often begins, not with a dramatic psychotic break, but with a quiet unraveling. The center doesn't hold. The narrative you've been telling yourself about who you are and why you're here starts to reveal its seams. And once you see the seams, you can't unsee them. The psychologist William James, in his masterwork, The Varieties of Religious Experience, documented hundreds of cases of what he called the sick soul, individuals who had lost the capacity to take life at face value. They had become too conscious of consciousness itself, too aware of the mechanisms of thought and feeling. And this awareness, rather than liberating them, had paralyzed them. James distinguished between healthy-minded people who could live unself-consciously and sick souls who had been cursed with excessive self-awareness. The sick soul, he wrote, cannot so straightaway throw off the burden of the consciousness of evil, but is congenitally fated to suffer from its presence. But here's what's crucial. James also documented that some sick souls, after descending fully into their crisis, emerged transformed. They became what he called twice-born, individuals who had died to their old self and been reborn with a deeper, more sustainable relationship to existence. The question is, how do you distinguish between a crisis that will destroy you and a crisis that will transform you? When you're in the middle of it, how do you know if you're having a breakthrough or a breakdown? The terrible answer is, you don't. You can't. From inside the experience, enlightenment and madness feel identical. The descent. Ego. Death without integration. In Buddhist psychology, they speak of dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately, the stress of maintaining the illusion, the constant effort required to keep the story of self coherent, to patrol the boundaries between self and other, to defend your narrative against contradictory evidence, to pretend that the person you were yesterday is the same person you are today. Most people never notice this stress because it's constant. It's the background radiation of consciousness. But when something triggers awareness of it, trauma, meditation, psychedelics, or sometimes just a random thought that catches you off guard, the stress becomes conscious. And once conscious, it becomes unbearable. Imagine you've been clenching your jaw for 30 years without realizing it. Someone points it out and suddenly you feel the tension. And now that you feel it, you can't stop feeling it. Every moment, you're aware of the clenching. The awareness doesn't make it stop, it makes it worse. Because now you're clenching and aware that you're clenching, and aware that you're aware, and so on in infinite regress. This is what happens when you become conscious of the effort of being a self. The Zen master Hakuin described his own experience of this crisis. After years of meditation, he achieved Kensho, a glimpse of his true nature. He saw through the illusion of the separate self, but instead of the peace he expected, he fell into what he called Zen sickness. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. His body felt like it was burning from the inside. He experienced constant anxiety, not because something was wrong, but because he had seen that there was no he to have experiences. Hakuin spent years in this state, traveling to meet teachers, trying various practices, unable to integrate what he'd seen. The knowledge had come too fast, without the gradual foundation that makes awakening sustainable. He had the insight without the wisdom, the seeing without the being. This is ego death without resurrection. This is awareness without integration. And it is perhaps the most painful state a human consciousness can endure, because you can't go back. Once you've seen that the self is constructed, you can't simply choose to believe in it again. The spell is broken. but you also can't fully let go, because the mechanisms of survival are built around that self-structure. You need an ego to function in the world. You need a sense of continuous identity to maintain relationships, hold a job, make plans. So you're trapped. You know the self is an illusion, but you're forced to perform it anyway. You're aware that you're performing, which makes the performance feel fake, which makes you more aware of performing, which makes it feel more fake, and round you spiral. The psychiatrist R.D. Laing described patients in this state as experiencing a knot, a logical trap where every escape route reinforces the trap. He wrote, "They are playing a game. They say they are not playing a game. If I show them I see they are, I break the rules and they will punish me. I must play their game of not seeing I see the game." But what Laing didn't fully articulate is that this isn't just about social games. It's about the game of being a self. And once you see that you're playing that game, you're caught in the ultimate double bind. You must play the game of selfhood, but knowing it's a game makes the game impossible to play authentically. This is the existential crisis at the heart of consciousness. This is where awareness feels like madness. The Hall of Mirrors, recursive self-awareness. Let's go deeper into the mechanism. Why specifically does excessive self-awareness create suffering? The answer lies in what we might call the recursion problem. Normal consciousness operates with a certain opacity. You think thoughts, but you don't typically think about thinking thoughts. You experience emotions, but you don't usually experience yourself experiencing emotions. There's a healthy distance, a gap between the experience and the awareness of experience. But when that gap becomes conscious, when you start watching yourself, you enter a recursion that can spiral out of control. The philosopher Douglas Hofstadter calls this strange loops, systems that achieve self-reference through multiple levels of abstraction. A camera pointing at its own monitor, creating infinite reflections. A sentence that refers to itself. This sentence is false. Consciousness aware of its own awareness, aware of its awareness of awareness, infinitely regressing. In most people, this recursion is limited by a kind of mental inertia. We get distracted, we engage with the world. The external breaks the internal spiral. But in some people, particularly those with philosophical inclinations, or those who've trained in meditation, or those who've used psychedelics, or those who've experienced trauma that shattered their default assumptions, the recursion becomes entrenched. You become aware of your awareness, then aware of your awareness of awareness, then aware of the awareness that's aware of the awareness of awareness, and suddenly you're trapped in a hall of mirrors, each reflection reflecting every other reflection, with no primary image to anchor to. You're looking for the looker, but every time you look, all you find is more looking. This is what the Buddha pointed to when he taught anatta. No self. There is no findable, graspable, essential self. When you look for the self, you only find looking. When you search for the thinker behind thoughts, you only find more thoughts. When you try to grasp consciousness, all you grasp is more consciousness. But here's the trap. The Buddha taught this as liberation. See that there's no self, and suffering ends. But for many people, seeing that there's no self doesn't end suffering. It creates a new, more acute form of suffering. The suffering of having no ground to stand on. The suffering of free falling through infinite awareness with nothing to catch you. This is because intellectual understanding isn't the same as realization. You can know conceptually that the self is empty while still feeling like a self. And that dissonance between what you know and what you feel creates a cognitive dissonance so severe it can fracture the psyche. The neuroscience of the abyss. Modern neuroscience has begun to understand what happens in the brain during these states of recursive self-awareness. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-regulation, planning, and executive function, can become hyperactive. Rather than smoothly regulating behavior, it becomes vigilant, constantly monitoring, constantly checking. This is sometimes called hyperfrontality, and it's associated with rumination, anxiety, and obsessive thought patterns. At the same time, the default mode network, which normally creates the sense of a stable self across time, can become desynchronized. The regions that should be communicating seamlessly start sending conflicting signals. The result is a fragmented sense of self. You feel like multiple selves, or no self at all, or a self that keeps dissolving and reforming moment to moment. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, may become chronically activated, because from an evolutionary perspective, ego dissolution is a threat. The organism interprets it as danger. Even though nothing external is threatening you, your brain treats the dissolution of self-structure as an existential emergency. This creates a perfect storm. You have a hyperactive prefrontal cortex analyzing everything, a desynchronized default mode network failing to maintain self-coherence, and an amygdala pumping out fear signals. The subjective experience is of being intensely aware, losing sense of who you are, and feeling terrified, all simultaneously. This is the neuroscience of existential crisis. This is what it looks like in the brain when awareness feels like madness. And here's the problem. The normal therapeutic approaches don't work. Cognitive behavioral therapy tries to challenge irrational thoughts, but these aren't irrational thoughts. They're accurate insights into the nature of consciousness. Medications try to dampen the fear response, but they don't address the underlying crisis of meaning. Mindfulness meditation, ironically, can make it worse because it increases awareness at precisely the moment when more awareness is the problem. You can't think your way out of the recursion because thinking is the recursion. You can't be mindful of the problem because excessive mindfulness is the problem. You can't find yourself because there's no self to find. So what do? The Dark Night tradition. The Christian mystics knew this territory well. They called it the Dark Night of the Soul, borrowing the term from the 16th century Spanish monk John of the Cross. John described a state where God's presence is withdrawn, where all previous comforts and certainties dissolve, where the seeker is left in absolute desolation. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because they've progressed too far. The dark night, John taught, is the sign of spiritual advancement. God withdraws the consolations to strip away attachment, even to spiritual experiences. But read between John's theological language, and you find a psychological description that matches our modern crisis perfectly. The dark night involves loss of previous sources of meaning and comfort, inability to engage with life as before, a sense of being watched or judged by an absolute presence, feeling abandoned by the ground of being, inability to go back to the old ways, but no clear path forward. Symptoms that look like depression, but aren't responsive to normal interventions. Sound familiar? The Dark Night tradition teaches something crucial. This isn't a problem to be solved. It's a necessary passage. The ego must be stripped of all its supports, including its spiritual supports, before genuine transformation can occur. You have to lose everything, including the one who's losing everything. But, and this is crucial, the mystics also emphasize the need for guidance. No one should attempt to navigate the dark night alone. The danger of madness, of suicide, of permanent psychological damage is too great. You need a teacher who's been through it. You need a community to anchor you. You need practices that provide structure without providing escape. Because here's the secret. You can't end the dark night through effort. The ego can't dissolve itself. The self can't transcend itself. The one trying to escape is the prison. So the practices aren't about achieving anything. They're about learning to endure the dissolution without resisting it and without being destroyed by it. This requires a paradoxical state: vigilant relaxation, engaged acceptance, surrendering without giving up. These aren't contradictions. They're the opposite of contradictions. They're the resolution of paradox through lived experience rather than logical thought. The pharmaceutical dilemma. In recent years, there's been an explosion of interest in psychedelics as potential treatments for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and existential distress. Psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, ayahuasca, substances that were vilified and banned for decades are now being studied in major research institutions, and the results are complicated. On one hand, many people report profound, lasting positive changes from properly guided psychedelic experiences. They describe ego dissolution that leads to reduced depression, increased life satisfaction, greater sense of connection. They meet the void and come back transformed rather than destroyed. But on the other hand, there are increasingly documented cases of adverse reactions. People who experience terrifying dissolutions they can't integrate. People who touch something so vast and impersonal that they can't fit back into their ordinary lives. People who, as one researcher put it, come back knowing too much. The problem is that psychedelics reliably induce ego dissolution, but they don't reliably provide integration. They can show you that the self is illusory, but they can't show you how to live with that knowledge. They can trigger the dark night, but they can't guide you through it. And increasingly, we're seeing a phenomenon that's being called spiritual emergency. People who have genuine mystical insights through psychedelics but lack the framework to understand or integrate them. They've had the experience but missed the meaning, as T.S. Eliot wrote. Or worse, they've gotten the meaning but lack the wisdom to carry it. This isn't an argument against psychedelics. It's an argument for taking consciousness seriously, for recognizing that these tools can open doors that you may not be ready to walk through, for understanding that awakening isn't always pleasant, and that the dissolution of ego, while perhaps ultimately liberating, is initially terrifying. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, who spent decades working with psychedelics in therapeutic settings, developed a map of consciousness he called holotropic states, states that move toward wholeness. He distinguished between experiences that are difficult but integrative and experiences that are difficult and fragmenting. The difference, he found, wasn't in the content of the experience, but in the context and the person's preparation. The same ego-dissolving experience could lead to breakthrough or breakdown depending on setting, support, and the person's psychological foundation. This is the pharmaceutical dilemma. We have tools that can reliably induce expanded states of consciousness, but we don't have reliable methods for ensuring those states are beneficial rather than harmful. We can trigger awakening, but we can't guarantee it won't feel like madness. The collective dark night. But here's what makes our current moment historically unique. This isn't just happening to isolated individuals. It's happening collectively. We are living through a species-wide dark night of the soul. Consider the symptoms: widespread loss of meaning and purpose, inability to believe in the old stories, religious, political, economic, increasing sense of dissociation and unreality, rising rates of anxiety and depression, feeling of being overwhelmed by awareness, of climate change, of injustice, of suffering, inability to go back to innocent unconsciousness. No clear path forward. Sound familiar? We are collectively becoming too aware, too conscious of the mechanisms of manipulation, the constructed nature of our institutions, the arbitrariness of our values, the fragility of our certainties. Social media has created a global panopticon where we're constantly aware of being aware of being aware. Technology has extended consciousness without expanding wisdom. We can see everything, everywhere, all at once, and it's driving us mad. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this the transparency society. Everything is visible, nothing is hidden, all is exposed to the light of consciousness, and in that total illumination, meaning dies. Because meaning requires shadows, mysteries, things not fully known. When everything is transparent, everything becomes equally meaningless. We are experiencing collective ego death without collective integration. And just like individual ego death, it feels like madness. The old structures are dissolving: the nation-state, the corporation, the nuclear family, organized religion. But the new structures haven't emerged yet. We're in the bardo, the intermediate state, the dark night writ large across civilization. The question is, will we integrate this awareness, or will it destroy us? Will we be twice born as a species, or will we fragment into competing delusions, each group creating its own reality in the absence of shared meaning? The answer may depend on whether we can learn, collectively, what mystics have learned individually, that ego death is not the end. That dissolution is the prelude to reconstitution. That awareness, however painful, is the prerequisite for transformation. But we're not there yet. Right now we're still in the descent, still in the conflict, still in the place where awareness feels like madness because we haven't yet found the wisdom to metabolize what we're seeing. The crisis deepens, and as it deepens, we face a crucial choice point. Do we retreat into comfortable illusions? Do we embrace the madness and risk fragmentation? Or do we find a third way, a way to hold the awareness without being destroyed by it? That third way exists. The mystics found it. The twice-born discovered it, and modern psychology is beginning to map it. But before we can find our way to awakening, we must first complete the descent. We must look fully into the abyss that opens when awareness turns upon itself. We must feel the vertigo, the terror, the dissolution, because only by going through it, not around it, not over it, but through it, can we emerge transformed rather than traumatized. The dark night is not the end of the journey. It's the middle, the crisis point, the crucible where consciousness either shatters or is forged into something new. So let us descend one last level. Let us look directly at the heart of the paradox. Let us ask the question that, once truly asked, changes everything. Who is the one experiencing this awareness that feels like madness? And when you look for that one, what do you find? Integration and rebirth. The turning point, when madness becomes method. There is a moment, impossible to predict, impossible to force, when something shifts. It doesn't happen when you're trying to make it happen. It doesn't arrive through effort or understanding. It comes when you finally stop, when you stop trying to fix yourself, trying to understand the paradox, trying to escape the hall of mirrors. When exhaustion defeats striving, when you surrender not out of wisdom, but out of having no other choice. The Zen master Linji described it as the one who is right now listening. When his student would come to him confused, caught in conceptual loops, desperate for understanding, Linji would shout, "What is it that asks?" This isn't a rhetorical question. It's an existential koan designed to redirect awareness. Because when you're caught in the recursion of self-awareness, watching yourself, you're still operating under an assumption that there's someone who's aware. But what if there isn't? What if awareness just is? What if consciousness doesn't belong to anyone because there is no anyone? What if the search for the self who's having this experience is precisely what creates the suffering? This is the insight that shifts everything. Not an intellectual understanding, but a lived recognition. The problem isn't that you're too aware. The problem is that you're trying to be aware as someone. You're trying to maintain a self while seeing through it. You're trying to hold on to the illusion while knowing it's an illusion. The shift comes when you stop trying, when you let the recursion collapse, when you surrender the one who's trying to surrender. And in that moment, in that gap, something opens. Not peace necessarily, not bliss or cosmic love, or any of the things the spiritual marketplace promises, but spaciousness, room to breathe, the recognition that awareness doesn't need a self to be aware, that consciousness doesn't require an owner, that life continues just fine without anyone living it. This is what the mystics mean by dying before you die. The self doesn't actually die. It was never alive. It simply stops pretending to be what it never was. And that cessation, that release of the pretense, is what we experience as liberation. But here's the crucial part. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. Because once the self-structure relaxes its grip, once you've touched the space where there is awareness without self, you still have to return to ordinary life. You still have to function in a world built entirely on the assumption of separate selves. You still have to pay bills and maintain relationships and make decisions. And this is where integration begins. The technology of integration, Jung called it individuation. The Buddhists call it embodiment. The psychologist Jack Engler put it perfectly. You have to be somebody before you can be nobody. Integration isn't about maintaining the peak experience. It's not about staying in the state where there's no self. It's about learning to fluidly move between states, to function as a self when necessary, while knowing it's a construct, to take life seriously while seeing its cosmic humor, to engage fully while remaining unattached. This requires what we might call psychological technology, practices, frameworks, communities that help metabolize the insights that would otherwise fragment you. First, grounding. You need anchors in the physical world. After ego dissolution, after touching the void, you need to remember you have a body. This sounds obvious, but it's not. Many people who've gone too deep into consciousness forget they're embodied. They live entirely in the mental realm. They need to be reminded. Breathe, move, feel sensation. The body is the foundation of integration. The yoga traditions understood this. They didn't start with philosophy or meditation. They started with asana, physical postures, because you can't navigate expanded consciousness without a stable nervous system, and you can't stabilize the nervous system without working directly with the body. Second, practices. Not practices to achieve something, but practices as containers. Meditation, but not meditation to get enlightened. Meditation as a daily return to presence. Prayer, but not prayer to petition a god. Prayer as a way of orienting consciousness towards something larger than self. Ritual, but not ritual as superstition. Ritual as embodied reminder of meaning. These practices aren't about progress. They're about rhythm, about creating structure in the formless, about having something to do when the mind threatens to spiral into infinite recursion. They're training wheels for consciousness. Third, community. This is perhaps the most important and most neglected. You cannot integrate alone. The ego will try to convince you that you should be able to do it alone, that needing others is weakness. But this is the ego's final trick, to maintain separation even in the pursuit of non-separation. You need mirrors. You need people who've been through the dark night and emerged. You need others who are currently in it, so you don't feel alone in the madness. You need witnesses who can say, yes, what you're experiencing is real, and yes, you can survive it, and yes, it will transform you if you let it. The anthropologist Angelis Arian studied cultures around the world that maintained healthy relationships with expanded consciousness. What she found was striking. In every case, there was communal support for the journey. Vision quests weren't solo adventures. They were supported by the tribe. Initiations weren't private. They were witnessed. The one undergoing transformation was held by a web of relationships. We've lost this in modern Western culture. We expect people to navigate consciousness crises alone. We pathologize experiences that traditional cultures would honor. We medicate states that should be integrated, and then we wonder why so many people fragment rather than transform. Fourth, meaning-making. This is perhaps the most delicate piece. After ego death, after seeing through the illusion of self, you need to construct new meaning, consciously, deliberately, knowing it's constructed. This is what Nietzsche meant by creating your own values, not arbitrarily, but authentically. Not because they're objectively true, but because they're meaningful to you. This is the art of living after awakening. To choose meaning even while knowing meaning is chosen. To commit to values even while seeing their conventions. To love even while recognizing love is a biological program. To create even while acknowledging creation is ultimately futile. This isn't cynicism. It's what the philosopher Susan Woolf calls active engagement with projects of worth. You engage fully, knowing it's a game, because playing the game with awareness is more meaningful than not playing at all. The reconstitution of self. Here's what's paradoxical. Integration doesn't mean no self all the time. It means skillful use of self. After awakening, after touching the void, a self reconstitutes. But it's different from the original self. The original self was unconscious. It didn't know it was constructed. It took itself to be absolute, essential, unchangeable. The reconstituted self is conscious. It knows it's provisional, contextual, fluid. It can be more flexible because it's not defending an illusion. The psychologist Robert Kegan describes this as moving from subject to object. When you're subject to something, you can't see it. You are it. When you make something object, you can see it, and therefore work with it. The shift from pre-awakening to post-awakening is making the self an object. You can still use it. You can still say I and mean something by it, but you're not trapped in it. This is what the Buddhist teacher Shinzen Jung calls functional sense of self versus dysfunctional sense of self. The dysfunctional sense of self is rigid, defended, needy. It requires constant validation, constant protection from threats. It creates most of human suffering. The functional sense of self is flexible, permeable, playful. It serves as a convenience, a way of navigating social reality, but it doesn't demand to be taken seriously. It's like an actor who knows they're acting but commits fully to the role anyway. This is the selfhood that emerges post-integration. Not absence of self, but lightness of self. Not no identity, but non-attachment to identity. Not egolessness, but ego held lightly. And paradoxically, this lighter self functions better than the defended self. It's more creative because it's not protecting a fixed image. It's more compassionate because it's not separate from others. It's more resilient because it's not invested in any particular outcome. It can engage fully because it's not afraid of dissolution. This is the reconstitution, the rebirth, the emergence from the dark night, not as what you were before, but as something new. Something that includes the awareness that shattered you, but isn't destroyed by it. The gift of post-traumatic growth. There's a body of research in psychology called post-traumatic growth. It turns out that many people who go through severe trauma don't just recover. They actually report increased well-being, deeper relationships, greater sense of meaning, more authentic living. The trauma, processed and integrated, becomes a catalyst for growth. The same is true for consciousness crises. The people who've been through the dark night and come out the other side often report that their life is incomparably richer than before, not because they're experiencing constant bliss, but because they're experiencing reality more directly. The filters are gone, the defenses are down, life touches them more deeply because there's less armor protecting them. The novelist David Foster Wallace, who struggled with depression and existential crisis his entire life, wrote, "The truth will set you free, but not until it is finished with you. The truth of no self, the truth of constructed meaning, the truth of consciousness as an impersonal process, these truths are devastating. They destroy your comfortable illusions. But if you can survive them, if you can integrate them, they become liberating. Because once you know that meaning is constructed, you can construct it more wisely. Once you know that self is provisional, you can be more flexible. Once you know that consciousness is impersonal, you can take everything less personally. The same insights that felt like madness become sources of freedom. This is the strange alchemy of integration. The poison becomes medicine, the wound becomes wisdom, the madness becomes method. But, and this is crucial, it only works if you go through it, not around it. You can't skip the dark night. You can't bypass the dissolution. You can't think your way to integration. You have to feel it, endure it, let it break you open, and then, slowly, carefully, with support and practice and time, you learn to live in the space that opened. The evolution of consciousness. Zoom out for a moment. Look at this not just as individual transformation, but as species evolution. We are at a unique moment in human history. For most of our species' existence, consciousness was limited, local, tribal. We were aware, but not hyper-aware. We had culture, but not global culture. We could reflect, but not infinitely recurse. Then came language, writing, printing, mass media, and now the internet and AI. Each technological leap has expanded consciousness, made us more aware, more connected, more capable of modeling reality. But each leap has also created new forms of suffering. Language gave us the ability to abstract, but also to worry about the future and regret the past. Writing gave us history, but also the burden of comparison. Mass media gave us shared culture, but also mass manipulation. The internet gave us global awareness, but also information overload and echo chambers. We are now facing the next leap, the moment when consciousness becomes aware of its own mechanisms. When we understand, scientifically and experientially, that the self is constructed. When AI forces us to question what makes consciousness special. When virtual reality blurs the line between experience and simulation. This is terrifying. It's destabilizing. It's causing collective crisis. But it might also be necessary. Because the old level of consciousness, the unconscious self, the tribal identity, the unquestioned narratives, is no longer adequate for the challenges we face. Climate change requires thinking beyond self-interest. Global pandemics require transcending national boundaries. AI requires understanding the nature of consciousness itself. We need to evolve. Not biologically, that's too slow, but psychologically. We need to develop the capacity to hold paradox, to function without fixed identity, to create meaning without needing it to be absolute. In other words, we need to integrate the awareness that currently feels like madness. This is why the crisis is both personal and collective, why individual awakening is connected to species transformation, why your dark night of the soul is part of humanity's dark night. The philosopher Ken Wilber calls this growing up and waking up. Growing up means developing psychological maturity, the ability to take multiple perspectives, regulate emotions, think complexly. Waking up means recognizing the nature of consciousness, seeing through the illusion of separate self. We need both. And right now, as a species, we're trying to wake up before we've grown up. We're getting access to consciousness-expanding technologies and practices without the psychological foundation to integrate them. Hence the crisis. But crisis is opportunity. The Chinese word for crisis combines two characters, danger and opportunity. We are at peak danger. The risk of fragmentation, tribalism, collective insanity is higher than ever. But we're also at peak opportunity, the possibility of genuine transformation, of evolving to a new level of collective consciousness. The question is, which way will we go? The practical path forward. So what do we actually do? How do we navigate this territory both individually and collectively? First, normalize the experience. Stop pathologizing consciousness crisis. Start recognizing that what feels like madness might be growth. Train therapists in the difference between psychotic break and spiritual emergency. Create support systems for people in the dark night. Second, slow down. The crisis is often caused by too much too fast, whether it's meditation, psychedelics, or just the overwhelming pace of modern life. We're pushing consciousness harder than it can integrate. Build in recovery time. Honor the need for rest, for integration, for embodiment. Third, create containers. We need modern versions of what monasteries and temples once provided, protected spaces where people can go through consciousness crises safely. Not psych wards that medicate away the experience, but integration centers that support the process. Fourth, rebuild community. The isolated individual cannot navigate this alone. We need intentional communities, practice groups, wisdom councils, spaces where people can share their experience without judgment, where the dark night is understood and honored rather than feared. Fifth, develop new philosophies. The old frameworks don't work for expanded consciousness. We need philosophies that can hold paradox, that don't require absolute truths, that are comfortable with uncertainty. We need meaning-making systems that are conscious of being constructed, yet still provide genuine orientation. Sixth, integrate technology wisely. AI and VR and brain-computer interfaces are coming. They will radically alter consciousness. We can either let them fragment us further, or we can use them as tools for integration. But this requires wisdom, not just innovation. We need to ask not just can we, but should we, and at what pace. Seventh, honor the wisdom traditions. Buddhism, Taoism, Sufism, Christian mysticism, they've been navigating consciousness for millennia. We don't need to adopt their metaphysics, but we should study their methods. They've mapped this territory. They've developed practices for integration. Why reinvent the wheel when we can learn from those who've already walked the path? Eighth, cultivate embodied presence. The answer to excessive awareness isn't less awareness. It's awareness grounded in the body, in the present moment, in direct experience. Teach people to return to their senses, to feel rather than think, to be rather than become. The wisdom of not knowing. Here's what I've learned, both from my own journey and from studying those who've navigated this successfully. The goal isn't to figure it out. The goal isn't to achieve some final understanding where it all makes sense. The wisdom is in the not knowing. The freedom is in the uncertainty. The peace is in surrendering the need for peace. This sounds like a cop-out, like spiritual bypassing, like refusing to give real answers. But it's not. It's the only honest response to the nature of consciousness itself. Because consciousness is fundamentally mysterious, we can study its neural correlates, we can map its states, we can describe its mechanisms, but the experience of being conscious, the felt sense of awareness, this remains irreducible. It can't be fully explained because any explanation is still within consciousness, so the awakened life isn't about having answers. It's about being comfortable with questions. It's about embracing the mystery rather than trying to solve it. It's about living fully while knowing you don't know what you are or why you exist or what any of this means. And strangely, that's enough. When you stop needing to know, awareness stops feeling like madness. It becomes what it always was. Just this. Just presence. Just life happening, without anyone needing to understand it. The Zen master Dogen wrote, "To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things." The awareness that felt like madness was the awareness still trying to be someone. Once you forget that someone, once you let the self dissolve not into terror, but into simplicity, the madness resolves. Not because you figured anything out, but because you've stopped trying. This is the final integration, accepting that integration is never final. Accepting that you'll sometimes fall back into identification, into suffering, into confusion. Accepting that consciousness is a process, not a state. Accepting that you'll never be done, never be fixed, never be finished. And finding freedom in that acceptance. We've traveled far together tonight. From the origins of consciousness turning upon itself, through the dark night of psychological dissolution, to the possibility of integration and transformation. We've explored how awareness can feel like madness when it reaches a certain intensity, and how that madness might actually be the birthplace of wisdom. But knowledge without practice is just entertainment. Understanding without application changes nothing. So let me leave you with something more than ideas. Let me leave you with a practice, a possibility, a way forward. First, recognize where you are in the journey. Are you still in innocent unconsciousness, living comfortably within the consensus reality? Then enjoy it. Don't rush toward awakening. There's no virtue in suffering unnecessarily. The crisis will come when it comes. But if you're already in it, if you're feeling the vertigo of too much awareness, if the self-structure is wobbling, if reality feels thin and arbitrary, then know this. You're not alone. You're not going crazy. Or rather, you are going crazy, but it's the kind of crazy that might lead to sanity. You're in the dark night, and the dark night, however terrifying, is a sign of growth. Here's what you need. Ground yourself in the body. Find a practice, yoga, tai chi, dance, running, something that returns you to physical sensation. When the mind spirals into infinite recursion, Bring awareness back to breath, to heartbeat, to the felt sense of being embodied. Find community, reach out, join a meditation group, find a therapist who understands spiritual emergence, connect with others on the path. You cannot navigate this alone. The illusion of separation is what creates the suffering. Connection is what enables integration. Accept the not knowing. Stop trying to figure it out. Stop searching for the self that's searching. Let the paradox be paradox. Let the mystery be mystery. Trust that consciousness knows how to integrate itself if you stop interfering. And remember, this is transformation, not destruction. The caterpillar doesn't know it will become a butterfly. From inside the chrysalis, it must feel like death. But death is required for metamorphosis. You're not ending. You're becoming something new. Something that includes what you were, but isn't limited to it. For those not yet in the crisis, consider this a warning and an invitation. Warning. Expanding consciousness is not always pleasant. The spiritual marketplace sells awakening as happiness, but the reality is more complex. It might make you happier eventually, but first it will likely make you feel like you're losing your mind. And the invitation? Despite the difficulty, despite the terror, despite the madness, it's worth it. On the other side of the dark night is a way of being that's more authentic, more alive, more real. Not because you've achieved something, but because you've stopped pretending. You've seen through the illusion and chosen to play in it anyway. You've died before dying and found that life continues, richer and stranger than before. This is the ultimate paradox. The awareness that feels like madness is actually the beginning of sanity, true sanity. Not the sanity of fitting in, of accepting consensus reality unquestioningly, of maintaining comfortable illusions, but the sanity of seeing clearly, seeing the construction, the impermanence, the emptiness, and choosing to engage fully anyway. This is what it means to be awake in the deepest sense. Not to transcend the world, but to be fully in it. Not to escape suffering, but to understand its source. Not to become enlightened, but to recognize that enlightenment is the natural state, obscured only by the belief that you're separate from it. We are living through a collective dark night. The old stories are dying, the old certainties are dissolving, the old structures are collapsing, and it feels like madness because we're between paradigms, the old world gone, the new not yet born. But remember what happens in the chrysalis. Complete dissolution is followed by reconstitution. The caterpillar liquefies entirely before the butterfly emerges. There's a stage where there's nothing but undifferentiated organic soup. No structure, no form, just potential. Maybe that's where we are as a species, in the soup, in the dark, in the madness of transformation. And maybe, just maybe, what we're experiencing isn't the end of consciousness, but its next evolutionary leap. Not the failure of awareness, but its expansion. Not madness, but metamorphosis. The question, as always, is, will you resist or surrender? Will you cling to the caterpillar or trust the chrysalis? Will you fight the dissolution or allow the transformation? Because this is the choice consciousness always faces when it reaches a new threshold: evolve or crystallize, grow or defend, open or close. And right now, individually and collectively, we're at that choice point. So I'll end where we began, with a question. Not a rhetorical question, but a genuine inquiry, one for you to sit with, to feel into, to let reverberate in the space where thoughts arise. If awareness itself is the problem, who is aware of that? Look for the answer. Really look. Turn consciousness back on itself one more time and see what you find. Not what you think you should find, not what philosophy says you'll find, but what's actually there when you look. Is there someone looking? Or is there just looking? Is there someone aware? Or is there just awareness? Is there someone having this experience of madness? Or is madness happening, and awareness is happening, and there's no one to whom it's happening? This is the gateless gate. the answer that's not an answer, the resolution that's not a resolution. And yet somehow it's enough. When you see it, really see it, not just intellectually but experientially, the whole crisis resolves, not because you figured anything out, but because you've stopped being the one who needs to figure it out. The awareness that felt like madness reveals itself as simply awareness. The self that was dissolving reveals itself as never having existed. The terror transforms into wonder. The confusion opens into clarity. The darkness becomes luminous. And you realize with a kind of cosmic humor that you were never lost. There was nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, no one to become. It was all happening already. Consciousness experiencing itself, awareness aware of awareness, the universe looking at itself through these particular eyes. You were home all along. Welcome back. Or rather, welcome to the recognition that you never left. This is the awakening that follows the madness. This is the transformation that completes the crisis. This is the wisdom that emerges from the wound. And now, having traveled through the depths together, having touched the void and returned, I invite you to carry this awareness lightly, to integrate it slowly, to share it wisely, to honor both the terror and the beauty of consciousness becoming aware of itself. We are living in extraordinary times, times that demand extraordinary consciousness. The challenges we face, ecological, technological, political, existential, require humans who can think complexly, hold paradox, function without fixed identity, create meaning without needing it to be absolute. In other words, they require humans who've been through the dark night and emerged transformed. So if you're in it right now, if awareness feels like madness, if the self is dissolving, if reality feels too fluid, know that you're exactly where you need to be. You're not broken, you're breaking open. And what emerges from that breaking might be exactly what the world needs. Trust the process, find support, practice embodiment, cultivate community, honor the mystery, and remember, the darkness isn't separate from the light. The madness isn't separate from the wisdom. The dissolution isn't separate from the integration. They're all part of the same process, the same transformation, the same awakening. You are that awakening, not having it, not achieving it, but being it, always already, right here, right now. And when you forget, because you will forget, when you fall back into identification, into suffering, into the belief that you're separate, simply notice, simply return, simply rest in the awareness that's already present. This is enough. You are enough. It has always been enough. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for your courage in exploring these depths. Thank you for being willing to question everything, including the one doing the questioning. May you find peace in the paradox. May you find freedom in the not knowing. May you find yourself in the losing of yourself. And may the awareness that once felt like madness become the very ground of your awakening. Until we meet again, in the space between thoughts, in the silence between words, in the awareness that contains all experience. Be well, be curious, be transformed. The journey continues. If this exploration resonated with you, consider sharing your own experience in the comments below. Have you felt the vertigo of too much awareness? Have you touched the void and returned? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. And if you're currently in the dark night, know that you're not alone. This community sees you, holds you, and believes in your transformation. Subscribe to continue this exploration of consciousness, psychology, and the evolution of human awareness. Together, we're mapping new territories of the mind and discovering that the very act of mapping changes what we find.